Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba Tashaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the O.R. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba Tashaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba Tashaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, C.O.R.E. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National C.O.R.E. and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Good morning. Greetings to the viewers. Come to you again, the Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. How's everybody doing? I see Brother Ugawa. I saw your post about 10 hours ago. For the last show, was entitled Twinlinealism, the Alternative to Aryanism. This topic addressed the long-range vision for just societies based on male-female empowerment. The twinlineal family and just society model, as I pointed out before, grows out of the Coon or Twa hunter-gatherer just society models. And it's a foundation for African and African-American cultures. My discovery of the male-female empowerment model or paradigm came from God's beautiful light, which is the way in which you're able to uncover truths of the cosmos that's there but not seen before. So God's beautiful light enabled me to discover the male-female empowerment paradigm from this beautiful light, which up to this point had been a secret in terms of what was the basis for these just societies. Of course, people weren't asking that too much because they weren't that much concerned about the Twa. So the discovery of this just society model that I characterize as twinlineal is a breakthrough in history comparable to the theory of relativity in quantum physics. You may think that's exaggerating it, but that is the major breakthrough in quantum physics, which again came from the mastery in the case of Einstein of some elements of quantum physics, but basically he was an ordinary physicist. It was the dream that led him to what's called the theory of relativity, that should be called the vision of relativity, or better yet, the law of relativity, because it enabled him to see something that was already in the cosmos that had not been seen, at least in modern times. So this twinlineal family model is comparable to that breakthrough because it provides a perfect definition for just societies, and it's an operational one. In other words, it's not a guess and it's not an idea to be worked out. It's based on over 130,000 years of historical practice by the Trois and then subsequent societies that followed it. And what's perfect about the definition of the twinlineal family model is that it grows out of the definition of just societies that's airtight, because in societies made up of males and females, what can be a more accurate definition of just societies than a society in which, or societies in which, males and females have equal power? I mean, simple. Males ain't got any more than females, females ain't got any more than males, and it operates. It's not a theory, it's a practice. And then all other kinds of models arise from it, starting with the family to the community and to the nation. So it describes empowerment on every level centered on males and females. And it's interesting that Europeans have constructed societies that are supposed to be just, that claim to be democracies that are not, and certainly are not centered around males and females. But you would think so based on all the talk. But behind the talk, there's no walk. So this was the beauty of it, and its simplicity, and its long-term practice, but particularly its simplicity, would defy the thinking of most what you call deep thinkers, because they'd be looking for something real complex, you know? So that's the basis for this. And because the just society, both family, community, nation, economy, every level, is based on this male-female empowerment, it means that this is something that you can use yourself, because the power is within you and in your relationships. And there's a lot more. So this is a model, and it's generally with the systems that I put forward. These are systems you don't have to wait until a revolution occurs where a society is completely transformed to apply it. It's a model that you can use today. I use it in my relationships. My wife does as well. We have a twin lineal relationship. And functional African families globally, and African American families in this country, generally are based on the same thing. They may not have a term for it, but it's based on balance and expressed in different ways. That's kind of like jazz. So that's also the beauty of this, that it's adaptable. So the twinlineal family model, based on just male female empowerment and masculine feminine synthesis, is really the key for rebuilding African and African American global families. And it is key for any people that really want justice in their life, harmony in their life, truth in their life, love in their life. It's good for everybody, but it is your model. It comes out of your culture. So this is key to taking Black families that are now in real crisis and revitalizing them. And it is really the key for Africa's regeneration, because it's got to be centered around the best models for males and females on the continent. And until it is, Africa is going to be out of whack and under colonial and now economic colonial, what we call neo-colonial models, where societies are controlled remotely like puppets on economic strings, and of course, psychological strings. So, my book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, is really the basis for this. And if you really want to understand this, you need to really um, dig this. As I pointed out before, when we were fighting the Hoover Institute that was trying to wipe out Black Studies, the right wing think tank um, in Palo Alto, that is now headed by Condoleezza Rice, who was National Security Council advisor to Bush II and Secretary of State to one of the dumbest presidents you've ever had. Of course, Trump beat all of them, but in terms of policies, um, Bush II just straightly goofed and started to age in his second term because he realized it, you know, because he allowed Cheney um, to run the presidency for the first time and ran the country into the ground, precipitated an earlier decline of America. If somebody had put a president in office to erode America, they couldn't have done a better job. So the Hoover Institute, which we defeated after a 2-year battle, I pointed out before, to destroy Black studies, now Africana studies at San Francisco State, had spied on our department for the 2 years. And they were writing a book on our demise because that would be the demise of the mothership, since Black Studies at San Francisco State gave birth to Black Studies at four-year universities. And though they may not have known it, they would have nipped in the bud the emergence of a revolutionary, spirit-based African discipline and African American discipline. And so a couple of years after they had gone after us, they then wrote a little summary, and I got a copy of it. And that's when I knew that they were spying on our classes, you know. And in there, they described the mother principle as my magnum opus. That is your masterwork. I said, well, isn't that nice? You better believe it is. If something comes from God and you do your work, it should be. You're cheating. God gave you help. So read Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality. Of all the things I've done, it was the hardest thing to do, the most pleasurable thing to do, and I think the most rewarding, because it's got the keys to the doors to just societies. And there's a lot more to it, and you need to read it. If you want to lead, you better read. So before getting in today's topic, I wanted to bring up a news item that has a lot of relevance to what was discussed in last week's show. And since one of my specialties is China, the other one's Mexico, and then, African and African American history, philosophy, and politics and stuff. So I take a special interest in China for a lot of reasons. So notice has just come from NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is a military alliance organized by the United States, made up of European countries, in the beginning, Western European countries. And it was organized for the alleged purpose of protecting Europe against Russia. Russia had lost 27 million people in World War II. Russia had saved the West from Germany. But America had turned Russia into the boogeyman. The Russians are coming. People were building bomb shelters and all this kind of stuff. When Russia, as in terms of its GDP, could never be a first-rate world power. its per capita income isn't much higher than ours, which is over $1 trillion. Ours is a little over $1 trillion. I'm talking Black people. Of course, they have a military, which was their mistake to put too much of an emphasis on after World War II. But the key point is NATO was formed to check Russia when Russia was no threat to Western Europe. Russia was a threat to Eastern Europe, which it gobbled up in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And then when that union fell, most of these Eastern European countries were free of Russia, so it's interesting that NATO, organized for this purpose, has just issued a new blueprint for the future. And this blueprint, you would expect to go further in demonizing Russia because they're engaged in a war, at least in supporting Ukraine. So you'd expect that that's be what it's about. But no, this blueprint singled out China as the central problem facing NATO. Now, you need to understand something. Since the fall of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, there has really been no justification for NATO. There was really no reason for it to begin with, because Russia was not going to be attacking any Western European country. It saved the West. If anything, their reward should have been offering them entree into the European Union and into NATO. But America needed a boogeyman, and the boogeyman was Russia. Scare the American people, which Truman did, and you've got the national security state, which is where most of your money's gone. That's why your schools are run down, your roads are run down, you ain't got any health care, you haven't got anything that any of the Western European countries have, and that a country as rich as this country should have. All behind spookism. The Russians are coming. So it's interesting that an alliance formed to check Russia, which never was a threat to Western Europe, and after the fall of the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, couldn't even be laid out to be a threat to the West, let alone the United States. And yeah, they have nuclear weapons, but so does America. So do a number of other countries in the world. Anyone that has a nuclear weapon is not likely to use one on another country that has one. So the boogeyman around Russia bombing America or America bombing Russia is a boogeyman, not to be believed seriously by anybody that puts their thinking cap on. So what's interesting is, first of all, that this blueprint policy statement is not addressing European issues, but China. And what do they say in this blueprint policy statement? They said China is a systemic challenge. Systemic. That means deep down into the systems of the West and the United States. It's a challenge to it politically, economically, socially, militarily. It's a systemic challenge. That's a big word, Yet this policy statement couldn't list any aggressive military action. And by the way, I'm not a defender of China. I'm just simply stating some facts here. So this blueprint policy statement couldn't list any aggressive military actions taken by the Chinese against any other power in the world, such as engaging in the kind of wars America has engaged in. Not one. China's been moot, other than the Korean War. And that's when MacArthur walked off into the 38th parallel. And Mao had warned him, come here, we gonna kick your butt. And Mao sent droves of Chinese soldiers after America And in my brainwashed days, I was in the Marine Corps Reserve. They call that a strategic withdrawal. That means they ran them out of North Korea. That was America's first defeat. Most people don't count that as a defeat. That was a defeat. You hear me? A butt kicking. You hear me? So, other than that, China has not, and of course, China engaged in a border war with Vietnam and lost. The Vietnamese kicked the Chinese butt right after the Vietnam War. But other than that, the Chinese have not pursued an aggressive military policy, and I wouldn't call Korea aggressive. That was defensive. So, but what the blueprint describes as China's systemic threat boils down to this. One, it says that China's policies are coercive, threatening. Here's the big bad wolf talking about their being threatened. China done put nowhere near the money in their military budget that America does. Ain't got the number of ships or anything else that America has. They've been smart. They've been pulling people out of poverty, while people in this country have been diving more deeply into it and going crazy as a result. So it also uses as a basis for a China threat its cyber operations. Well, guess what? All nations are using cyber technology to pursue their interests. America is, every country on the planet is. And then they go on to say that China's malicious. Now where's the substance? Where's the beef? Where's the meat? Malicious in what kind of way? It means that they're not kissing America's butt. That's what it means. And its rhetoric is confrontational. Since if it is, and it isn't, but if it is, since when is rhetoric confrontational? I always thought that if confrontational means getting into something. Huh? So this blueprint policy statement also linked China with Russia and charged both of them with going against the rules-based international order. Now, this is a big issue because the rules-based order is referring to the Bretton Woods Agreement, an order established by the United States, shaped at Bretton Woods, an area on the East Coast outside of New York, that established the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and through Roosevelt and Churchill in a meeting that they had at the White House during World War II, created the United Nations, something that Churchill didn't like. So what's the real crime China's committing here? Remember when I talked about Aryanism last week, I pointed out that it is based on a Lord Master syndrome, and essentially the essence of Aryanism is power. It's particularly arbitrary power exercised by those that have it, and that is the Aryan culture. And it cuts across all ideologies. So the Russians also have that same philosophy. And so what's China's real crime is that it is the second most powerful nation in the world. And second means soon to be first. That's the crime. Under Aryanism, that's a serious crime. You know what I mean? But since when is it wrong for people to be powerful? When it's not you. And especially when that power is going to supplant yours, not by conquering you or anything, but by simply outgrowing you. You understand? So can we see evidence of this? I'm not going to go into all the details, but the largest nation state in South America is Brazil. That's in America's backyard. According to the Monroe Doctrine, South America, the Caribbean, that's their backwater. You understand? But guess who Brazil's number one trading partner is? China. Now, Australia is a part of a coalition of Western European countries led by the United States, and they are in on some of the sharing of top secrets, um, you know, among the so-called Western powers. Of course, Australia's in Asia. And guess what? China's Australia's number one trading partner. It's displacing America economically. It's not going to war. Militarily, if anything, it's an economic warfare. Now, the two strongest countries in NATO, Germany and France, are both reluctant to follow America's policy because this policy that's hostile towards China is being driven by the United States. And Germany doesn't like it because particularly their automobile industry is heavily dependent upon the Chinese market. The Chinese buy a huge number of German cars, as they should, because they are made well. Only the Japanese make a car as well or better than the Germans. America has all but lost the automobile market because of the lousy products they produce. It's mainly trucks and stuff that America is putting out now, and they're not going to be very competitive. So the real issue with China is power, and it is the fact that the U.S. is hostile to a rising China when America is in decline in every possible way and seems to be shooting itself in the foot as much as possible, politically and every other way. So take note of that, because this is going to continue to be a news item. I want to note that Tito District, Hire Hecka, Sandra Henderson, or Lysandra Henderson, no, Shonda Henderson and LaShonda Henderson, Steve McKenzie, S.K.N.R.B.G. and Lao Tzu, and of course, the brother who is really working hard in terms of building this show. I want to say welcome to all of you. And I see Malik Aziz has just tuned in. Malik Aziz has a radio program in Florida. He used to be in the Black United Front, ex-athlete, I don't know if he's still in the Nation of Islam, but was in the Nation of Islam. Beautiful brother. Welcome, brother. Glad to have you on. And then Cinnabar, my back and everything else. This show wouldn't be operating without him. So that's kind of news for the background. Oh, and brother Kamari's on here. About time, Kamari. Get your butt on. Where's your lovely wife? And by the way, did she get my message? You know, if she did, tell her to do something about it. Okay, so my topic for today deals with a key issue in building Black power, and it's the issue of systematizing African consciousness. And by the way, S.K.N.R.B.G. is from St. Kitts and Nevis. Hey, right on. You ought to be on this show because we will put a lot of praise on the Caribbean today. A whole lot. And that's a praise on Africa, you know. So my topic for today is dealing with the key issue in building Black power, which is systematizing African consciousness. Because if you're going to free a society, you got to free minds. And it's the freedom of the mind that is the one we often talk about, but pay least attention to. So my topic for today illustrates how the sixfold stages to mental freedom works through examining the development of the African consciousness of three great African leaders: Toussaint L'Ouverture, Amilcar Cabral, and Miss Ella Baker. She always preferred to be called Miss Ella Baker. That's a Southern Black thing. Miss and Mr. And was MS, even when she was married, you know. So My two books, The Art of Leadership, Volume 1, which has Amilcar Cabral in the center, Ella Baker, Garvey, King, and Malcolm on the cover, and The Art of Leadership, Volume 2, which has Toussaint up on the top, Fannie Lou Hamer. The brother on the other side of Toussaint is one of the major leaders of the San Francisco Freedom Movement, the only successful Black freedom, Black power movement in the 60s to now, and most people don't know it. He was head of the NAACP, one of four militant heads of the NAACP in the 60s, and below him and below Fannie Lou Hamer is Kwame Nkrumah, and of course, the brother from South Africa, Nelson Mandela. These books are the only books in the modern world on African and African American leadership systems and traditions. It's not a book on great Black leaders. And these books took me 10 years to write. They drew from what was then my 30 years of organizing and leadership experience, which is now 63 years. And it drew from the organizing and leadership experience of African people globally and in this country, and the leadership and organizing experiences of the world. That includes our enemy. If they got something that works, study it and counter it, learn how to counter it. And if you need to, use it, you know? So the art of leadership is part of what this discussion is about, which is addressing the systematization or the organization of African consciousness, particularly revolutionary African consciousness. Now, Amilcar Cabral, who you see on the back here with the sunglasses behind me, the greatest leader, thinker, organizer, military strategist in the 20th century, in the opinion of many, noted that liberation movements are expressions of culture. And in most cases, they express them unconsciously. In most cases, the liberation movements are not conscious of just how deeply they are expressing the culture of their people. Now, the most obvious cultural expressions are clear. For example, in China, the outside world will, refer to Mao Zedong as Chairman Mao. Inside China, he was called emperor and was treated like an emperor. And I was in Asian Americans talking to a chair of Asian American studies years ago, George Wu, and I asked him, because he was from China and then, Chinese American. I asked him, what was the secret to Chou En-lai's success? Chou En-lai ended up being the person in charge of foreign affairs for China, had one time led the Chinese Communist Party. And he said the secret was Chou En-lai was always silent in a discussion, and when the discussion was over, he agreed with Mao. And that's the way to stay in power under a Confucian emperor system. So China expressed Confucianism as a part of its culture, empirism in terms of how it's ruled, and you see that now with the leader of China now moving into his third term, which would put him into 30 years when he completes it, which had been a prohibition since the death of Mao. Leaders had been limited to 10 years. So this is China. It's an expression of emperor culture, Confucian culture, and some other things. But that's the nature of liberation movements. And then when they get into power and become governments, that as well, particularly when their culture hasn't been disrupted. China's was partially, but not largely. So my book, The Art of Leadership, Volume 1, starts with a central definition of African leadership. And this would include African American leadership, African Caribbean leadership. And it describes this definition as African leaders play a twin role. And the very definition of leadership is twin. First, they lead through following. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were true mouthpieces of the people, as was Ella Baker, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee consciously. Their voice was the people's voice. King certainly agreed with this statement because he said that he didn't start the Montgomery bus boycott. He didn't initiate it. He didn't organize it in its beginning. But when the people called on him, he stepped forward as a spokesperson for the people. Neither King nor Malcolm, and I don't think Ella Baker, knew that this idea of leaders as mouthpieces of the people is an expression of African culture. Ella Baker knew it was an expression of Southern Black culture. I never heard her refer to this as an expression of African culture. But as I pointed out in previous shows, this notion of leaders being mouthpieces of the people is an expression of, in its very beginning, hunter-gatherer societies in which there were really no leaders. Everybody was a leader in that sense. But then when agrarian societies come into being, in the very beginning, they're small agricultural societies. Men and women are both farmers. For most of Africa, it would be women who are the farmers. Decisions were made at the village level. And it was all the males and females having an equal say-so. That's the male-female empowerment twin-lineal model. And it is that model that was at the heart and soul of African leadership and organizing traditions carried into the US. Now, it's not the sole model. Royal systems were carried in as well. And King embodied both of them in certain ways because on the one hand, he served the will of the people, the just will of the people, and stuck to it. But on the other hand, his name was King. He behaved that way. And in terms of how Southern Christian Leadership Conference operated, they didn't go to the people asking the people, how should they do this? These ministers got together and made the decision. So they acted like royalty in that sense. And we know that in the case of Elijah Muhammad, who claimed to be the messenger of Allah, there's this divinity thing going on. So we carried those things too. You know what I mean? But the best of these leadership traditions and systems were those where the males and females equally empowered and leaders are mouthpieces of the people. And this carried us through Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction. Groups made decisions, and individuals who went forward and spoke to white people, they were speaking on the behalf of the group. And the whites didn't know that. And they did not. Local, rural Southern Blacks did not consider a national spokesperson like Frederick Douglass by the end of the Civil War a leader because he didn't live among the people. It's not that they didn't respect him. And as they said, they had to pay to come hear him speak. You know what I mean? You don't pay to hear no real leader who's your mouthpiece to speak. He's going to speak for you, So because leaders are mouthpieces of the people, therefore leading is following. Leaders follow the people's will. And you don't get a movement unless you're following what people want, because it's only when people decide to rise up, in this case, Black people, African people, that any movement occurs. Montgomery bus boycott only happened because the people decided to back that move and stand up, 97% of them in Montgomery, Alabama. So that's how movements work. And ain't no single person that comes along and just creates it. The people make the decision to go into motion, and then people come forward who speak for them. That's the best case, at least. So leading is following. This means that the leadership tradition is a democratic expression. And this democracy does not come from American democracy, because American democracy is hypocritical. There ain't no such thing as American democracy. The people who run this country own it. And you figure that out. They can commit any crime and not go to jail. Drop bombs on people like the Japanese who are ready to surrender and claim that they were justified and not do anything about it. Poison your community with toxic chemicals, they ain't going to jail. Or even dope up white people with all these drugs coming from medications that doctors prescribe. And they might end up paying a little fine. That's it. As the head of the Continental Congress was asked, when he was asked who should rule America, he said the ones that own it. So our leadership conceptions are an expression of our culture. They don't come from America. America ain't no democracy. America's a hypocrisy. Say one thing and do another. So this leadership philosophy of leaders are followers, those are your best leaders. And that means that they're always open to the people. They're serving the people's will and needs. This derives from a twin philosophy that I call cosmic philosophy, which is the philosophy of the cosmos. And it is reflective in all areas of African and African American and African Caribbean culture. So, in this culture, just as leading is following, good is bad. Bad is good. Life is death, or life is slow dying. That's what life is. You're dying right now. Learn to befriend that. If you do, you'll appreciate every moment of life. The blues are the spirituals, as I've gone through before, because the spirituals are really about everyday life, the ups and downs of everyday life. There is no secular without the sacred, because spirit is in everything. Positive contains negative. I've said this before in the African American folks saying, they have a saying about what it is to be human. It says, in the best of us, there's bad. In the worst of us, there's good. There's no goody-goody 2 feet on this planet. Everybody's got positives and negatives. And that's what we're here for, to work on them. The masculine is the feminine. In other words, you can't separate masculine from feminine. The feminine is the masculine. And the strength is in the way in which these two are synthesized, with the male having more of the masculine, the female more of the feminine. A teacher is a student, because a good teacher is learning from their students. My book, The Integration Trap, came from a question that a student asked that I couldn't answer. It produced a book. It was embarrassing not to have the answer, but the real embarrassment didn't come from not having the answer, or giving the wrong answer. It came from not knowing. And that led me on the path of what became this book, The Integration Trap, Generation Gap Caused by a Choice between two cultures. So cosmic logic is always connected. That is, there's no good without bad, or positive without negative, or life without death. The same with revolution. Reform provides the seeds for revolution. Revolutionaries make the mistake when they jump out of the reformist period and just jump fully into revolution when a revolution isn't occurring. And that was made by some of our Black freedom movement organizers in the 60s, when they suddenly became so revolutionary that they deserted their bases And we're pontificating on the long range thing, whether it was the unity of Africa or overthrowing this country or engaging in armed struggle or whatever. They didn't understand that their transformation came through reform. And many of their people had not reached their point yet. And so, reform, the struggle for jobs, for housing, for education, for medical care, and so forth, which isn't revolutionary but improves people's lives, is the precondition for a revolution. It does not mean it will automatically occur, but you can't get to that without going through it. I know I was one of those and continue to advocate reforms that are positive in changing people's lives while being a revolutionary. That is not a contradiction. So, reforms contain the seeds of revolution. Systematized African consciousness is an organic expression that is experienced when a person undergoes awakening. One of the real tragedies in our movement, say, of the 60s is that some of our leaders didn't push the envelope and keep going through the developmental processes as they engaged in struggle that involved the awakening context. Some did, and those got good results. Those that didn't, this contributed heavily to their failure. Huey Newton would have done much better had he been able to immerse himself more deeply into the culture, into the history. The fact that he did was one of the reasons that the Panthers was successful in getting off the ground. And there are many other movements like this that would have been stronger had they gone into more depth into their culture and developed, particularly the leaders. And we'll see why that's important in a minute. So there's an organic path to transformation. Now, I give all movements an excuse for this. Until recently, we hadn't discovered what it was. But if you went through it, you'd experience it even if you couldn't describe it. And that would describe what Malcolm went through in the beginning. He underwent the depths of the organic transformation, but by his death, if you ask him, what were the stages of awakening? He probably plowed to get it because he was too close to it. The same with me or anyone else that went through this awakening process. So the topic for today is systematizing the African consciousness of Toussaint, Cabral, and Ella Baker. Systematizing the African consciousness of Toussaint, Cabral, and Ella Baker. And I'm going to be using them as an illustration on the surface because you only understand this when you go through it. This is not something that you're going to get just by an intellectual explanation. And so I'm using these three figures as examples of how this transformational process works on a level. And there's much more to this than I'm going to cover today. And in the end, will only be understood by you if you're undergoing that process. And if you recognize where you are on the continuum and you're working on yourself. So, as I pointed out before, Vulindlela Wabogo, who's a chemist, martial artist, a jazz pianist, and a historian, and I uncovered these stages of awakening. I added a stage that I saw after. As I pointed out before, Vulindlela Wabogo, who at one point had been a member of RAM, Revolutionary Action Movement, I hired him to teach at San Francisco State, and we interacted in various ways. We were both on the 6th Pan-African Congress delegation. He was dealing with the science component. He's a chemist. And he helped me edit my book, The Mother Principle. And he and I together uncovered these stages. He used Frantz Fanon, Wretched of the Earth. I always thought that he brought more to Fanon's statements than even Fanon had. But he marked stages of awakening. And then I did so by looking at my own awakening, Malcolm's, and others, and also exchanging with him. And so we discovered these 6 stages of awakening. And today, when I look at Toussaint, Louverture, Amilcar Cabral, and Ella Baker, we'll locate each one of them within a particular stage of awakening and show how they negotiate it. We're not going to go into the great details of this. By the way, the book I'm working on now, Seba, deals with this. The Integration Trap covers this, and The Art of Leadership, Volume 2, covers this awakening process. And by the way, this provides the part of the answer to Carter G. Woodson's question around miseducation of the Negro when he posed the problem as foretaught the same philosophy, history, culture, and so forth of the European, using my term, those so miseducated have been put on remote control. So during the era of segregation, you didn't have to tell a Black person to go to the back seat. Their miseducation would condition them to do so, and they would do so without being told. And he said if there wasn't a back seat, they would carve one out. So the 6-fold stages to mental freedom answers the question of what's the process for freeing the mind. And this doesn't only apply to African people, it applies to people of color because they go through a similar set of processes. I know some of y'all don't like to hear that because you think that it's just Black folks. But guess what? Other people have been colonized, particularly, and therefore taken through certain stages of unconsciousness. So these 6-fold stages, and for those who have signed up for the 6-fold stages class when we have 40, we'll be starting that. The 6-fold stages describe the levels of consciousness or unconsciousness caused by the conflict with enslavement and colonialism, and the Caribbean both, because they would undergo slavery and then colonialism. And so the 6-fold stages are assimilation. That's for some. Or in the context of the African in the U.S., Black identity, which is dealing with Black culture. And in the Caribbean, it would be Creole, or the African culture dropped into the Caribbean and then hit by European influences. And so, you have this reality with the African culture predominating. So African people generally who have undergone colonialism or enslavement are in one of two places: assimilation or the Black culture, or the new African culture that we've created here, or the Creole culture that some people call it in the Caribbean, that is basically African with some European elements alongside. But the African predominating. And often in the Caribbean, with the masses of people not even conscious that this is African, because they'll say, I'm a Jamaican, man. I ain't no African. Now, the Rastas won't say that. Conscious Jamaicans won't say that, but a whole lot will. And the Blacks in America, the same thing. I ain't no African. Or at best, I'm an African descendant. What does that make you? You know what I mean? I'm Black. I'm not African. You know what I mean? More African than you know. Almost everything you like happens to be African, including your mama. And if you don't, you're in real trouble. You know what I'm talking about? And she's imparting the most African stuff your Black behind ever got. You know what I mean? So there are two different types: some who are in the assimilation stage, some who are coming out of the cultural stage that Africans develop in the Caribbean, South America, or the US, or wherever we are in the diaspora. So these are stages in this 6-fold process. There's a stage that I added called pre-disturbance, which is a stage where people experience racism, but really aren't able to figure it out and confused. Assimilation is the stage where you take on the identity and the culture of the oppressors. And the new African or a Black one or Creole one is where you take on this identity, which has got a heavy African foundational base with contradictions. And this is part of what we'll also discuss today, because the new African culture or the Creole culture that's created in the Caribbean that's hybridized, there's one alongside the other, European and African, will have contradictions, meaning that there's going to be the penetration of European influences into this culture. And that's going to be part of what you have to overcome. But this culture is so rich, it can do a whole lot for you. So some are in assimilation, some are in the culture created in the US that I call New African or African American, or Creole, or African Caribbean, or African South American, and more traditional African in the Caribbean, South America. So I pointed out before, because Africans were in the majority in these islands and in these nations. And so therefore, it was harder for the European to interfere with these cultures. And I want to stress, in those that were Catholic, then you're going to see the strongest continuation of African culture. And Haiti is a subject for this discussion through Toussaint, and you're going to see some very strong cultural expressions, especially spiritual, but in others as well, because Africans could hide African culture under Catholicism, but couldn't under Protestantism. They could continue it in different ways, but especially when it came to the spirit system that people call religions, which ours are not, you could not in the Protestant countries maintain the full form of the spirit or religious system. I'm using religious just for you to recognize it, of Yoruba, Sante, whatever. But those could continue in the Catholic setting of Haiti, Brazil, Cuba, places like that. The other stages in this is pre-disturbance, where people face racism but aren't really clear about what it is and don't know how to handle it, and disturbance, where they face racism and are upset, and it triggers some things that can lead them to African identity. And for some, a very few, revolutionary African consciousness. So these are the stages. There's a lot to them. And when we go through this, people will get to experience it and deepen their own transformation, growth, and development. And I should point out again that we only have to address this because of the intrusion of slavery and colonialism. And as a result of that, disrupting ancient and traditional African systems, therefore, we've had certain things introduced into our lives that are alien, and it requires a transformational process to overcome those that are damaging, because not all that's new is negative. A lot of it is positive, particularly the new African and the Creole or Afro-Caribbean cultural forms, very positive in many ways. So the stage of assimilation comes through the imposition of enslavement or colonialism, or both, where Africans and people of color who take on this mentality, and that's not the majority of the people, have this desire to imitate their oppressors. And in part, that's the nature of oppression, that the oppressed want to imitate the oppressor. That is what leads to assimilation, trying to take on the identity of the oppressor. But because of the nature of the culture, of African culture, that is carried into the Caribbean, South America, and the US, and the creation of a new African culture in the US, a Creole or African-based culture in the Caribbean, the majority of the people are going to reflect that. They'll have contradictions, some more than others. But Carter G. Woodson, if you looked at his book, Miseducation of the Negro, he was really, when he talked about miseducation of the Negro, he was really talking about the miseducated, college miseducated African. Those who had taken on the values of the oppressor through their miseducational systems, and noted that the people that could make the greatest contribution were the ones who were least brainwashed. Now, implying this to slavery, generally, it's assumed that the more privileged Africans, the house slaves in the US, and some of them were skilled slaves on the plantation, and in the Caribbean, the drivers, the plantation managers, the slave drivers themselves who drove slaves, and you had those in the US and others, that they tended to be the assimilated ones. That's the assumption. And certainly in the US, the house slaves were, those that produced the ones who were assimilated, but not all of them were. And that's when we deal with Ella Baker, you're going to see how that played out in her family. Not all of them were, but more of them were. And betrayal of a rebellion tended to come from this group. And so the same is true in the Caribbean, and especially in countries like Haiti, where you have the French system, where the French would take their offspring and sometimes send them to France for miseducation and create a group of mixed blooded Africans who identified more with the slave master than with their own people. And so that's a part of the issue that the Haitian people face to this day. But you also have Blacks who have that mentality as well. And Garvey talked about that in Jamaica, those Africans who had internalized a white mentality. But so there's generally that distinction. But we're going to see with Toussaint, it's much more complex than that, especially in the Caribbean context, but also in the African American context. So the highest expression of the art of African and African American leadership, therefore, is expressed through the art of systematizing African consciousness. This is the highest expression because it's when we're able to do that we're able to truly be Africans in the best sense, because that is an unfolding process. Cultures are constantly changing. And in the process of systematizing our consciousness to the highest levels of African consciousness, we're able to then take ourselves higher and higher as a people to become better human beings. But in the case of the new African culture in the US and the African Caribbean culture, there are also contradictions that exist. And of course, in the case of assimilation, at its extreme, you have the extremes of self-hatred. The Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas is the example of the extreme self-hating African. Most Africans do not fit that description. It's usually somewhere in between. And with many having a deep sense of self-love and Black pride, and others who don't. So in the case of assimilation, as well as in the case of the contradictions that we find within the cultures that we recreate in the Western Hemisphere, including the United States, The systemization of consciousness, the transformation of consciousness is especially important for the purpose of uprooting issues of self-hatred, issues of individualism, issues of elitism, issues of materialism, issues of patriarchy, where men think that they had the say so and women need to shut up and be put in their place, the issues of greed, the issues of arbitrary power, and many others. These are the negatives that don't just reside in the new African cultures we create, but they reside inside of human beings. And in traditional Africa, they existed as well. Not assimilation, but elitism, materialism, um, exercising lordship over others. This emerged even in some of the greatest civilizations we created, and especially when foreign elements were introduced. So this transformation therefore requires a life-death rebirth transformation, meaning dying in one state of unconsciousness and being reborn into a higher state of consciousness. And this is a lifelong process. And if you ever give up on this, you'll find yourself backsliding. So this is the nature of the systemization of African consciousness. It's constant work. It's like working out in the gym. You know, it's good to work out whatever period of time, but then if you let up for too long, then fat's going to develop. Your muscles are going to get weakened, and it's the same thing if you aren't working on this identity. Then the Negro is going to creep in. That is, the unconsciousness is going to creep in. Those weaknesses that we all have are going to creep in because we all got them. So why is my primary emphasis on this placed on the leadership? It is not solely, but primarily, and their transformation. This is because when you reach the decolonized situation in Africa or the Caribbean, it's the leaders, the people coming from the middle class that will end up running these nations. They'll end up being the prime ministers, the presidents. They'll end up heading up the economy, the military, and other sections of these nations. And if their minds are on the colonial plantation or the enslaved plantation, then they're going to rule these nations the way the colonizers or enslavers did. In fact, the very notion that they're ruling is an indication that they have adopted their mentality. They're not coming in with the idea that they are mouthpieces of the people, that they need to represent the people's best will and just will, and therefore, as so-called leaders, they're spending time among their people, finding out what they wanted. I worked in the Ujamaa villages in Tanzania. That was Nyerere's style. He was always in the villages, learning from the people. You know what I mean? And his idea of Ujamaa, or sharing through the family, was a revisit on African communalism, or the idea that air, land, and water is shared. And so he was trying to translate that into modern circumstances. And to the extent that Ujamaa worked, it worked because it was rooted in the people. To the extent that it failed, it was because this elite group of Blacks around Nyerere had no faith or belief in their people. And this is the fundamental problem for Africans today, whether we believe in ourselves or someone else, So the first emphasis of this transformation of consciousness is on leaders because they will affect the society. But secondly, this applies to the people as a whole. Because number one, while the people as a whole carry the jewels of the culture, they also got contradictions based on the experiences of enslavement and colonialism And then now, what I pointed out, since the post-68 period, especially in the US, a choice between two cultures, where powerful forces have led us to step outside our culture. And in Africa, we're seeing this in different ways as well, with child soldiers being used and very often recruited and given the first assignment of killing their own parents. What kind of mess is that? You just can't attribute that to colonialism either. This is some post-colonial stuff that's even got worse in some ways than colonialism. Colonialism contributed, but it ain't the primary thing that's leading the way in that case. So the freeing of the mind, therefore, requires that we free ourselves from the contradictions that arise from slavery and colonialism that put us in the jailhouse mentally, have us psychologically imprisoned and incarcerated. And so it's those things that we have to identify within ourselves and undergo that transformation. And that's true for the grassroots as well. But the grassroots is going to have less work to do to the degree that they've been less influenced by the system, to the extent that they've been corrupted, like a lot of our youth have by gangster culture, for example. They got a lot that they got to deal with. We saw that in a discussion with the Minister of Culture of the Black Panther Party. It's not a good strategy to recruit the so-called lumpen or people engaged in crime with the idea that, well, since there's no jobs for them, which is not necessarily true, therefore we can have them engage in revolutionary work part-time. There's no such thing as part-time revolutionary. And so while they're on the job, they don't take drugs. But if you're a drug addict, you're going to be an addict on and off the job for Black folks. You hear me? And if you're an unreformed rapist, as Eldridge Cleaver was, you're going to be doing that on and off the job. So the transformation of consciousness of a lumpen person is a life, death, rebirth transformation, the kind Malcolm underwent, where you die as with a criminal mindset, with a beast of prey mindset, and you're reborn as a person who's in love with their people. So don't romanticize the cat who comes out of prison just because he was in prison. A Geronimo Jenga Pratt who comes out of prison was a revolutionary when he went in and was a revolutionary that came out. And if George Jackson became a revolutionary in prison, had he ever got out, he would have made a hell of a contribution. But if you haven't undergone a transformation of consciousness, then there's no such thing as a part-time revolutionary who, but 8 hours is in the movement, and then the other hours is out here preying on people. You hear me? So transformation of consciousness is good for everybody, but especially these leaders. So I'm going to look at 3 figures, and they represent 3 areas of the world. Toussaint L'Ouverture, Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean. Amilcar Cabral, Africa. Ella Baker, Africans in the United States. So this is a representative sampling that should tell us something. If we find this transformation of consciousness prevailing in all these areas, just as we find this twin lineal model prevailing all over, then this is a universal system that's good for everybody. You hear me? Huh. And as somebody who's still undergoing it, I can testify, because I don't put out nothing until I've mastered it myself. And I'm still in the process of mastering this. It's a lifelong process. So I'm going to start this examination of the 6-fold stages of mental freedom, how it applies to Systematizing African Consciousness, I'm going to start by looking at one of the greatest revolutionaries in the history of the world. And because Blacks just love to put ourselves down, we always find some fault and therefore can't see daylight when the sun is shining. Can't see victory, but only see defeat. Can't see greatness because we'll see some faults. And there's definitely going to be some faults that we discuss here. But I'm going to start this with, and the majority of this discussion is going to be on this person because this is the one in which we have the greatest confusion. I didn't even include Malcolm on this discussion because a lot of people already know Malcolm. And if they don't, they should. So I'm going to start with the freeing of the mind process and how it works by dealing with one of the greatest leaders in the history of the world. The only leader, along with a few others like Desalines and a few others, who led the only successful slave rebellion in the history of the whole wide green earth. And yet we have Black folks talking about how messed up the Haitians are. And y'all know me, I'm on this African cultural thing, but I'm also on African American culture. And we have the most complex culture in the world, and it is the popular culture of the world. But I'm going to say the strongest culture of African people outside of Africa, and it may be the strongest in Africa, is the Afro-Haitian. Why do I say that? Because their culture produced a result that no other culture of enslaved people have produced: their own freedom. And that's a hard thing to do, especially when it involved not some little old runaway from slavery, which was a big deal, because that was the main way we got our freedom here in the US, petty maroonage, that is running away. It nearly broke the back of slavery, not through a little slave revolt here or there, but the defeating the greatest armies that the Aryan could put in the battlefield, whipping them to the ground. You hear me? And that includes Napoleon Bonaparte, who was at one point considered to be one of the baddest warriors that Europe had produced. They whipped them. The credit belongs to the people and the culture first, and its leaders. And of all of them, the most skilled, the most adroit militarily, the most accomplished strategically was Toussaint Louverture. And by the way, my favorite hero is Desalines. So, you understand? So don't think I'm putting Desalines down. In fact, Desalines fills in Toussaint's weaknesses. We'll cover that at the end. But if you want to talk about some genius, Toussaint, he deserves the top of the list, but he often doesn't get it. You hear me? Because we've misread what he represents. And that's because we've misread slavery. You hear me? And its effect on Africans who have undergone it. So there are two classic works up to this point, and now another one, on the Haitian Revolution. One is Black Jacobins by C.O.R.E. James. And C.O.R.E. James is a great Trinidadian African who is one of the founders of modern day Pan-Africanism. He's someone that I knew. He stayed in my house for a week, read my draft manuscript on Malcolm X, and was kind enough to offer to publish it, even though he couldn't have possibly agreed with some of it, because I was writing to contradict the Trotskyites. This is a wing of Marxism that claims to support nationalism while they're actually undermining it. And Leon Trotsky, who was one of the greatest thinkers in the Russian Revolution, is the leader of this movement. And C.O.R.E. James was a Trotskyite. But in spite of that, he wanted to publish this book. And I learned something from him when he offered that. that I've tried to embrace in my own conduct. As long as people's intentions are good, support them. I learned that from him. You know what I mean? So he's a great man, a great man. So his book, Black Jacobins, is a classic on the Haitian Revolution. And I see some people on Facebook putting out stuff on the Haitian Revolution, partially right and partially wrong. And when your butt gets corrected and people tell you to go read Dr. Jacob Carruthers' book on the irritated genie, which is the other classic on the Haitian Revolution, go read it. Because they're telling you something that if you're putting out something that you're getting questioned on, you need to read. And then there's a new book that's come out called Black Spartacus. And I've got it right here. This book right here. This is a masterwork, you know, on the Haitian Revolution. I know a lot of you, you watch YouTube and whatnot and you get your information, but please believe me, you should do your homework too. Go do some reading. And your best readers in the modern world, best leaders have been readers. Toussaint was one of them. So C.O.R.E. James' book makes the mistake of characterizing Toussaint as a leader whose inspiration for revolting against France came from the French Revolution. And that's why he titled his book Black Jacobins. The Jacobins were French revolutionaries. So what he's saying is basically that Toussaint was a black white boy, meaning his whole inspiration for taking part in the Haitian Revolution was the French Revolution, And this is in part understandable because C.O.R.E. James was a Trotskyite. And so they have this idea of world revolution and stuff. And then he hadn't done some of the groundbreaking research that's being done now, but that was incorrect. And Jacob Carruthers corrected that in his book, The Irritated Genie, by showing that the main inspiration for the Haitian Revolution came from the Maroon traditions. That is the African traditions carried from Africa to the Caribbean and the United States, where Africans would escape from slavery, go to the mountains, and use traditional African culture, often following their own chiefs and priests and whatnot, to launch rebellions. And this happened all over the Caribbean in certain parts of the United States, particularly in the swamps in Louisiana and places like that. So Jacob Carruthers' book was a corrective on that and should be read. And it's a brief book. Jake always wrote briefly. Jake was my master. All praise to Jacob Carruthers, brilliant brother. He wrote a number of things. Intellectual Warfare, which deals with the whole Afrocentric intellectual movement. I think his best book is on African culture, Medu Neter. That's his best book, a very small book also. But, his book shows that the motive for the Haitian Revolution came out of Afro-Haitian culture. So this idea that C.O.R.E. James put forward, and his book is a classic, and it's outstanding for many reasons, but he's wrong on this point. He falsely characterizes the revolution led by Toussaint and others, but he was the principal leader, as a reproduction of French republicanism. First of all, Toussaint had his own motives, as did everyone else that took part in the Haitian Revolution, for opposing enslavement. And it was basically that they were opposed to slavery. But the main things that inspired Toussaint came out of African and African Haitian culture that inspired him. He also had contradictions, but they're not as big as people think. So the other error that is made in characterizing and interpreting Toussaint and his consciousness and contribution to the struggle is the assumption that because he came from the elite, he helped manage the Breda plantation, which was in northern Haiti. And he also was a driver. That is, he, did some driving on the plantation. It doesn't mean he drove people, but, did driving horses and whatnot. And was left in charge of the plantation when its owner went off somewhere else. So because of that, because he came from what's called the elite, he is characterized as a brainwashed, self-hating person who hated his black skin and turned his back on African heritage. That's a common assumption. And C.O.R.E. James leaves that assumption there. He doesn't correct it. But this isn't just an error made based on certain assumptions made by C.O.R.E. James, but by other African historians and other historians on the Haitian Revolution as well, including some who have embraced Dessalines. Some of them see Dessalines as the carrier of African culture, but Toussaint is not, and that's incorrect. And in some ways, Toussaint was a deeper carrier of the culture than Dessalines. In certain ways, Dessalines was more conscious of some things where Toussaint was weak, and we'll get into that. In the context of the sixfold stages of mental freedom, I will locate Toussaint's identity within the stage of African and Creole culture with some assimilationist influences, but not predominant, but serious. But the overriding influence on Toussaint is not assimilation. He's not in the assimilation stage. It's African culture and it's African Creole culture. And by the way, in the Haitian context, you had two types. The Bosalis, these are the Africans who come directly from Africa. Toussaint's father came from that category. 60% of the Haitians at the time of the Haitian Revolution came directly from Africa. Now, that's something in and of itself that you should look at, because we like to specialize this African in America on how brainwashed we were. How brainwashed could they be if the overwhelming majority of them came straight off the boat from Africa? We call them here saltwater Africans. And so there's the Bosalis who are straight up from Africa, and then the Creole. And so there's an attempt to divide them. And while some that I've already described do fit that category, those with the European blood that identify with it, and those who take on the mentality of the oppressors who happen to come from the elite, and probably a few from even the field who took on the mentality of the oppressor, but very few. But the Bosalis and the Creole had much in common. The Bosalis were concentrated on preserving their culture. And the Creoles, and Toussaint would be an example of this, he is the second generation. His father came from Africa. He was born of his father, native-born African, and so he is of the Creole extraction, and we're going to see how African that is. But it means that there was a crossing and intermingling between these two, and basically Creole culture, which is heavily voodoo but also has a Christian superstructure in some cases. Some people claiming to be Christian, but practicing voodoo, but most of them being voodooists. There's a interchange between these two, and the Creole is standing on an African foundational base. So in looking at Toussaint, you're going to see that African and African Creole culture play the major role in shaping him. And this is what's not been appreciated about Toussaint. But there are contradictions that I'll deal with in the end that are serious, but do not characterize the main essence of Toussaint, but would characterize his fundamental error. We'll get into that in a minute. So let's start with Toussaint's view of himself, because I'm sick and tired of people who do this amateur psychological psychoanalysis, and it's always on the outside, but they ain't looking at what the people themselves say, you know? Like in this country, they wiped our culture out. You don't know anything about your culture. Run around here talking about Willie Lynch. There was no such person. Black people waged cultural war on the plantation in this country. Why? With what? With African culture, as it was reformed into new African culture. And we came out with our humanity intact. And so what did Toussaint say about himself? He said, quote, let me quote him. I was born a slave, but nature gave me the soul of a free man. Let me repeat that. I was born a slave, but nature gave me the soul of a free man. Now you'll say, oh, that's exceptional, because you brought into this brainwashed crap that passes off as history, but usually presented by psychologists that don't know history. You hear me? Huh? Well, let me say this, and I'm speaking for Africans in the Caribbean, South America, and the United States. This was the normal attitude of most enslaved Africans. You hear me? That you might have slaves, enslavement around my wrist, you might have the shackles around the wrist and around the legs, but my soul is free. My spirit is free. Whatever you may think. This was a common view. So that's why, and I often repeat this is the mantra of the enslaved African America, but he spoke for the Africans in America as well, the Americas, Caribbean, South America, whatever. That song that before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. That was the mantra of a person who did not see themselves as slaves. They didn't accept it. That's why they were regarded by whites who observed them as people of nobility. They maintained their nobility. And in fact, the noblest Africans are the ones coming right after slavery. That's true in the Caribbean, South America, and the US here. You hear me? They're the ones that carried themselves with the greatest dignity. They were also rough and tough. Slavery had not made them soft. And, they administered some things to us we didn't like whippings and a legacy of slavery. It's something we need to discard. But they carried African pride. Yeah, some of them had color complexes and blah, blah. But they had this core essence. They kept their humanity intact. These were the most sharing Africans, the most self-help oriented Africans. They're the ones that built all Black towns in the U.S. You hear me? And across the Caribbean, they were the ones that built up the economies of the Caribbean based on ground provisions that's more healthy than all this import stuff that you get, that enabled Africans to survive. And that only since the 70s has been weakened by the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and other groups that have come in and weakened strong Jamaican economies based on African farmers who, had their own cattle, had their own milk, had their own agriculture and made people healthy and happy. Yeah, they didn't have a lot of money, but they had the things of life that you need. You hear me? So this came out of African culture. Now, Toussaint's father was a major influence on him. And remember, his father came directly from Africa. Toussaint's grandfather was named Guinou, Guinou. Toussaint's father taught him that his father, Toussaint's grandfather, was a king of the Allada Nation, Allada, Allada Nation. The Allada people were West Africans living in the southern part of the Gold Coast of what's now called Ghana. They were warrior people. And Toussaint's father carried that warrior spirit. One reason why Toussaint could get away with whipping a couple of white boys on the plantation and standing up to the plantation manager was that these white boys didn't want to cross his father. And his father was a major influence on him, the greatest influence on him in his upbringing. His father was separated from his wife, thought that she was still in still in Africa. And later, after he had remarried, and he remarried an Allada woman, she found him. And it broke her heart when she found that he was now married to someone else. And she died shortly after that. But the key thing is, Toussaint's father married an Allada woman, and they both, but especially the father, passed on Allada culture to Toussaint, so much for assimilation. But again, people didn't study this part of Toussaint. Toussaint was like Africans in general, to this day, was surrounded by African culture, including African music, African dance, African games, spirit practices that you call religion. African ideas about nature, such as that every part of nature is a spirit. He was surrounded by stories about the supernatural and by Africans who wore country marks. Those are scars. As I pointed out before, country marks were indications of the level of initiation that an African had gone through in secret societies. He was surrounded by Africa. And these secret societies played a big role in launching the Haitian Revolution. So Toussaint believed that he was descended from royalty. He was descended from warrior people, and he taught his children these truths. So much for assimilation. His Allada warrior identification was expressed through his own self-discipline. He prepared himself for what he identified with, an African warrior. Now, he had great physical discipline as well as mental discipline. He was a brilliant person. But Toussaint's health as a child was very poor. He was skinny. His health was frail. There was fear that he might die because a lot of African children died at a young age. So to overcome these weaknesses, through exercising self-discipline, Toussaint became the fastest runner, the best climber, and the best swimmer. By his teens, he had become an equestrian master, that is, a master of horses. He was one of the best horsemen in Haiti. He was so good that Afro-Haitians came from all over Haiti to learn horseback riding and the handling of horses. He liked to tame a horse while he was wild on his back. And that meant he got thrown and sometimes injured. This guy had courage. Horsemanship was very important for warriorhood, by the way. Huh? He could outride any Frenchman. He was so good at horseback riding that once he forded a stream that was flooded by standing on top of the horse and giving it direction. Huh? Now that's some horseback riding. You hear me? In the revolution, Toussaint was in constant motion. He was on horseback all the time, traveling from one end of the country to the other, you know? Now, a key thing about a good warrior, especially a general, but a good warrior, is they need to know geography. They need to know every crook and cranny of a particular country or geographical space. And one of the things that put the French at great disadvantage in fighting the Haitians was they knew every corner, and Toussaint was a master of every crevice, rock, corner, river, stream, and everything else. He knew the gorges, the passes, the tides, the least predictable pass, because that's where you could strike a blow sometimes. He knew the depth of a forest. His mastery of geography was one of the keys to his orchestrating military strategies. And I won't go into his military strategies, but I'll say that he pretty well laid his strategies out, and you're supposed to follow them. And if you did, you got victory. You hear me? This guy was that good. Now, Toussaint's supposed to be assimilated, right? Well, guess what? His father taught him to speak the Alata language, and he spoke it regularly. And in the course of the revolution, engaged many of the revolutionaries in the language of Africa. Many of them were straight up off the boat, and they were quite happy when he would flip from Creole, which he spoke regularly, into the Alata language. And of course, when he spoke Creole, he was speaking an African-based language with French, European words mixed in, but coming from a Niger-Congo Bantu linguistic base. The same one that blacks speak here, but it is in a more pure form in a country where you're 97, 98, 100% of the people. Wow. Toussaint's father also taught him the knowledge of herbal medicine, how to use herbs to cure people. This is real key. This part of Toussaint is unknown. Now, this is especially important because in enslavement, Africans could live very short lives. And this herbal knowledge was used by Toussaint to cure people, you know. And so this was extremely important in his own development and in his own education. Now, here's the big deal, because there's going to be two sides to this one. Toussaint was a practitioner of voodoo. This is generally not known. We know that he was a Catholic, and I'm going to get into that at the end. But he was a voodoo practitioner. Voodoo is the African spirit practice, what the West calls the African religion. It's actually a Pan-African mixture of, in this particular case, Alata, Asante, Yoruba, Dahomey, and other African spirit systems that are basically the same, combined with Native American spirit practices. And the Native American people of Haiti were the Taino people, T-A-I-N-O. And these were people who also practiced a spirit system that you call religion. They passed this knowledge on to the first Africans to come to the island. And so voodoo was a mixture of African spirit systems and combined with Native American. And while the Taino people were very peaceful, their spirits were fierce. And so the Africans drew on all of this. And so voodoo is a spirit system where the practitioners communicate with the spirits that are called Loas, Loas, and they communicate in different ways, one of which is through spirit possession, where through certain ceremonies, spirits are brought down to possess people and often reveal things about the past, the present, and the future. In the US, these were the diviners. In the Caribbean, these were the Obia men and women, particularly in Protestant countries where you couldn't maintain the holistic system that you could maintain under voodoo. And these were also the transmission belts through which African culture was passed spiritually. Now, the oral tradition of Haiti makes it very clear, and this is the history of Haiti. White people don't like to deal with the oral tradition. If you can't find something in writing, it doesn't pertain. But among an oral people, history is passed on through word of mouth, and people's memories are their libraries. And when a person dies, they say a library died, you know? And their memories are trustworthy because they're coming out of cultures based on the truth. Until recent in the Caribbean, which is true of Africa, transactions are often oral, land transactions, whatever, because the person could be trusted. Now you better put it in writing, you know? So what does the oral tradition of Haiti say about Toussaint's participation in voodoo? They say he was a boko, B-O-K-O, which means a voodoo priest. But he wasn't just any voodoo priest. He was a voodoo priest with exceptional supernatural powers, kind of on the order of the Twa that we've talked about, but African people in general. And because he was an herbalist, he had a high level of healing powers. And he could communicate with the good spirits. That's telling you a good person. Good spirits. By the way, that's what George Washington Carver did. He didn't consider himself a priest, but he communicated with the spirit of plants. And in the case of the context of voodoo, that's what Toussaint did, but in a spirit-based context. So you're saying that Toussaint is expressing African and Creole culture through the spirit practices, through the language, through the healing practices, and through disciplining himself in the warrior traditions, which were the traditions of Africa, translated into Haiti or Santo Domingo. This was the African and New African Toussaint Louverture. Now, there's a common myth that Toussaint's inspiration for the revolution came from the French Revolution, and this is created by C.O.R.E. James. C.O.R.E. James argued that, as I pointed out in introducing this. This is dispelled by a number of facts. Number one, the French Revolution itself had the revolutionaries, the Jacobins, had no concept of Africans freeing themselves from French enslavement. They had no idea of that. So how could Toussaint be inspired by that? Because he thought, like Africans did on the plantation, that whatever was good would enable them in the pursuit of freedom. So, number one, the Jacobins were not committed to advocating slave rebellions. Huh? Not hardly. Now, the most important thing is the Breda, Breda plantation, which is in northern Haiti, was near the area where the voodoo priest Makandal launched one of the most important rebellions in the history of insurrections in Haiti. It was the first of the major ones. Makandal's plan was to poison all the whites, something that didn't work. But he was a great hero to the Haitian people. Toussaint, in all likelihood, witnessed his murder by the French when he was captured. And Toussaint, like all the Africans of Haiti, worshipped Makandal, who was also a voodoo priest. Toussaint was not about imitating Makandal. Obviously, you're going to have to go beyond trying to poison all the whites. But he took elements of Makandal's approach and combined it with his new recipe that would make up the Haitian Revolution. So this is Toussaint, and I don't have time to go into his revolutionary contributions, his war strategies. They were brilliant. But the key thing is that Toussaint was coming out of both African and African Caribbean, in this case, Creole culture. And he thought in that realm. So in the main, he was not culturally assimilated. In discussing the sixfold stages to mental freedom, I made the point that the new African culture in the US and the African Creole culture in Jamaica had contradictions, you know? And some of these contradictions were positive, some were negative, because Creole culture itself is a new creation, necessary, because you're coming under a new environment, necessary to combine different spirit systems coming out of Africa that have a lot in common, and to bring in Native American spirit traditions, and a whole host of other things. But in the case of Toussaint, there were also contradictions in the Creole culture, and these have to do with the influence of Catholicism on Toussaint. First, Toussaint was taught to read and write by the Jesuits, and the Jesuits are one of the most skilled intellectually orders in the Catholic Church. And during the time of their presence in Haiti, they were viewed by the Haitians, enslaved Haitians, as supporters. Whereas in this country, it was a crime to teach enslaved Africans to read and write. They taught them reading and writing. And they were hated by the enslavers and eventually were run out of Haiti. But he learned to read and write from this group, the Jesuits. And he came to embrace Catholicism to the point that he went around trying to recruit other people to Catholicism. So he's in voodoo, but he's also into Catholicism. And, you know, there's a saying that the Pope has that when he travels to Brazil and people like places like that, they'll say that the people are 90% Catholic and 100% practicing traditional religion. And that's basically what was going on, including with Toussaint. And And Toussaint was a person who personally liked to be alone a lot. He liked to work on self cultivation. He was a person who was trying to raise himself constantly to a higher order in the midst of battle. That was his nature. Toussaint was also a person that hated bloodshed. And being a voodoo high order priest, he would have a high value for life. And so, in some ways, he shared some qualities with Amilcar Cabral that we're going to get into next, of having a regard for life, viewing it as precious, and not wanting to shed any more blood than was necessary. So this was Toussaint. Toussaint took from the Jesuits certain principles, most of which are consistent with African culture, but when flipped, in some cases can work against you. And these central teachings had to do with harmony, compassion, and brotherhood. Now, harmony and compassion are central to African humanism, to African culture. So is brotherhood. But in the case of the Haitian conflict context, Toussaint regarded the treatment that he received at the hands of the Jesuits as an expression of a high order of brotherhood. He knew that the average Frenchman in Haiti was a savage, that Africans were blown apart. They would put dynamite in them, blow them up. They would throw them in an oven and burn them up. They would cut them into pieces. They would castrate them. The same things they did here. Don't ever say that slavery here was more devastating than the Caribbean. They did the same thing everywhere. They would bury people alive up to their necks, as my grandmother said they did in Mississippi. And in the case of Mississippi, put honey on their face and let the ants eat them alive. They would do all of this. Toussaint knew this. Toussaint said that slavery was an institution where mothers were separated from husbands, sisters from brothers. He knew this, and he experienced it himself. He was separated from his own sister. And he knew of the story of his own father's separation and observed the oppression of his people on the Breda plantation, though he, because he had such influence, kept it to a minimum. So Toussaint's mistake was in embracing Catholicism. He held out this hope that humanism and brotherhood could be applied to whites in general. And so some of his policies, when they free themselves from French rule, he's too lax on the whites. In part because he believes that he can't build up an economy without their skills, and especially internationally, he needed to neutralize Western powers so he could move across the oceans, because if he was landlocked, it would be hard for him to do anything. He couldn't trade or anything else. And so while he was in power, he was able to play the French off against the British off against the Americans, and he was able to negotiate some pretty good maneuvering when it came to trade. But when it came to the idea of brotherhood, he didn't learn the lesson that Toussaint learned. And that was the lesson. You couldn't, I'm going to take this from my first wife. Her father had this saying: you couldn't trust a white person behind a toothpick. And Toussaint, unlike Toussaint, had the brutal experience of enslavement. Toussaint knew it, and he identified with his people and opposed this treatment. But he didn't know it in the way that Toussaint did. So this was his weakness. And I should say this. That's also a strength, in that humanism can't really be described as being a weakness, being a human being. This was Hannibal's weakness when he had defeated the Romans at the Battle of Cannae. wiped out over 55,000 Romans. The whole Roman army was destroyed. He had Rome in his hands, but he refused to take Rome. John Henry Clark concludes, and my reading of the history leads me to conclude the same thing. He didn't have the heart to kill old men, women, and children. But when Scipio Africanus II, whose father Hannibal had defeated in his first battle in Rome, when Scipio Africanus decided to use Hannibal's strategy against them, Hannibal had brought the Second Punic War to Rome. So Scipio Africanus decided to bring the Roman war to Carthage. Hannibal then had to leave Rome, didn't have time to train his elephants or a good army because his army was made up of paid soldiers. He lost the battle and eventually the war, and eventually Carthage, which is now Tunisia, was turned into salt. So this humanistic thing that we have that I don't think we should lose, we just need to learn how to be tougher under certain circumstances. But I want to say this. If you look at Toussaint, and I haven't begun to discuss all his contributions, he comes out an admirable human being, an exceptional human being, but not exceptional for the African. What's ordinary when it comes to humanism and humanity for the African is extraordinary for everybody else except Native Americans, you know? So those of us who've got the we sick syndrome, to the extent that we are, you need to ask yourself where it came from, because some of it did come from enslavement. But a lot of this mess you're dealing with right now ain't got nothing to do with slavery. The choice between two cultures, this has got to do with families being torn down more between 68 and now than between 1868 and 1968. And these are due to powerful hostile forces. Jamaica has not been reduced to this level of poverty because of the legacies of slavery. It's the legacies of neocolonialism caused by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And Africa sees itself faced with these same things now that requires leadership that's devoted to the people. And at that time, Jamaica had good leadership in the name of Michael Manley. But the problem was the global order and being able to stand up against it. So Toussaint's an example that to truly free your mind when you're coming out of an African and African Caribbean base, then what you need to do is to heal the negative aspects of African, in this case, New African or Creole culture. This is the key. But our people are in pretty good shape. And the African in Haiti is the most impoverished African in the Western Hemisphere, one of the most impoverished on the planet materially, but the richest culturally and spiritually. And we should do everything we can to kick America's ass out of Haiti and let the Haitians do for themselves. And tell Biden you ain't giving him a vote until he stops deporting Haitians, 20,000 of them. You hear me? Those Afro-Haitians, and by the way, the ADOS people who don't want to deal with Africans outside of America, these Africans outside, the United States, these Africans outside of the United States gave us the inspiration to launch the Denmark-Vesey Rebellion, to launch the Nat Turner Rebellion, and a host of others. You hear me? Quit talking nonsense and talk some historical sense. Now, the last two I'm going to deal with, and these aren't going to be lengthy, are Amilcar Cabral and Ella Baker. Amilcar Cabral is an illustration of how in the sixfold stages of mental freedom, you move from assimilation to African consciousness. Cabral came from Guinea-Bissau. His parents came from Cape Verde. Cape Verde is an island off of Guinea-Bissau. The Cape Verdeans were heavily assimilated. Cabral's father had been educated and thought about becoming a priest, but abandoned that idea. Thank God, because we wouldn't have Cabral if he followed through on his priestly vows and didn't marry. Cabral's father, like Toussaint's father, had a great influence on him. Of all the influence, of all the masters that influenced him, my study of him indicates that his father had the greatest influence. His father was not a revolutionary, he was a progressive Cape Verdean. He was critical of Portugal's colonial agricultural policies that put a lot of emphasis on export crops, leading to famine among people in Cape Verde and in Guinea-Bissau. And so his father argued for diversified agriculture and a scientific agriculture, which African people knew and practiced. This encouraged Cabral to go to Portugal and to major in agriculture. He became an agronomist. And of his class of 300, only about 23 graduated. He was at the top of his class. This was a good major for someone who is going to become a leader of an African independence movement and hopefully of an African nation, because the economy of Africa is agrarian, it's agricultural. But Cabral had a problem. When he went to Portugal for an education, he identified as a Portuguese, just as some of us identify as being Americans, in case you think that's funny. But it's when he takes part in, and he was the leader of it, of an African study group in Portugal, made up of Africans from the colonies under the control of the Portuguese, Mozambique and Angola, and in his case, Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. They began to study African history, African culture, African poetry, and it wasn't just the African on the continent, it was the African in the diaspora. And so as a result of this, Cabral underwent a transformation. And he said, we decided to become African. And those who took part in the study group that Cabral had called it Cabral's generation. The leaders of Angola and Mozambique, they saw Cabral as the shining light. And so it's with this transformation of consciousness that Cabral would return to Guinea-Bissau during the summer and try and carry out cultural programs as a student. And sometimes he would be able to broadcast programs on the radio. Sometimes those programs would be cut off. But when he underwent this transformation of consciousness, he made the decision that he would return to Africa and lead the people of Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau in a struggle against colonialism to lead to the independence of his people. Cabral makes this point in the sixfold stages to mental freedom. This is real key. This is not academic. You don't get a transformation of consciousness just by reading books. You have to immerse yourself in the people by joining their struggle. As Cabral said, the awakening to African consciousness and then later to revolutionary consciousness only occurs when you join the people in a common struggle for liberation. And that's the key to the sixfold stages to mental freedom. Reading alone won't produce it. In fact, my awakening came through the heat of struggle in the midst of a Black freedom movement. Malcolm's came in imprisonment, where he experienced the first experiences of mental freedom. And Cabral's in a study group, but it wasn't completed until he joined the people in a common struggle for liberation. Cabral's main project, in addition to carrying out the armed struggle, was to transform the mindset of the youth that represented the future leaders of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, who he took after a failed peaceful attempt to gain independence, took to Guinea and then trained through leadership training. But his main effort was to transform the consciousness of these Africans, because he knew when they came to power, if they came to power with the colonial mentality, they would become the oppressors of the people. Cabral had a lot of exchange during this time, late 60s and the early 70s, with Kwame Nkrumah, who was in exile in Guinea. And of all of his guests, Nkrumah regarded Cabral as the most important. And Cabral had a chance to learn from Nkrumah, not just through what Nkrumah taught him, but examining what had actually happened in Guinea, that his party had become extremely corrupt, the Convention People's Party. And he could see that he had to overcome those tendencies of materialism, of elitism, of arrogance that arise out of the colonial mentality of greed, which also arises out of the negative conditions of being a human being, because some of us are inclined towards that, whether we're oppressed or not. And so Cabral was trying to reshape a group that could become servants of the people. He was assassinated before that work was completed. And I should say, in part, the assassination occurred for the same reasons that Toussaint weaknesses got him on a ship that put him in prison in France. He was a humanistic person, and I don't think he should have given that up. But his humanism led him to go too far. His party had captured the people who had been sent by the Portuguese to capture him. The Portuguese didn't want to kill him. They wanted to capture him. And they were allowed out of prison. And when Cabral was at a party congress in Guinea, when he comes back, these guys are loose. They grab him. They have weapons. Cabral refused to be tied up, and they shot him. And with him, a good deal of the hope of what could have happened in Guinea-Bissau evaporated. But the key point is Cabral's contributions as a original political thinker, military strategist, was centrally based on his transformation of consciousness and his Africanization from an assimilated mindset, and his growing revolutionary consciousness, which was not Marxist, which is a mistake that a lot of people make in analyzing him. He used a lot of Marxist terminology, but Cabral was coming up with his own original analysis. And that analysis was based, as I pointed out before, on understanding how the various ethnic groups in Guinea were organized and how you could approach them in an armed struggle, carried out through his social analysis of the social structure of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. So Cabral is proof of the fact that if you are going to get out of a white mindset, you have to undergo a transformation of consciousness from assimilation to African identity. And part of it comes through study. A lot of it comes through drawing from the culture of everyday people. My awakening came through everyday people. Norman Brown, who was the brother that initially woke me up, coming from the first all-Black town that Zora Neale Hurston was from, that where Blacks organized themselves. Finally, Ella Baker. Ella Baker is in many ways like Cabral in that she comes out of the popular culture. And so she is a reflection of the popular culture of Blacks living in North Carolina. Interestingly enough, Coltrane comes out of North Carolina. Now, Ella Baker's roots go back to slavery. Her grandmother and grandfather had been enslaved Africans. The grandmother was the product of a enslaver and an African woman. She was a house slave. But contrary to popular views of house slaves, she was proud of being Black. And when she was told by the so-called master, her father, that she had to marry another house Negro who was of light complexion, she refused. And they put her on the plantation. But the so-called master instructed those on the plantation supervising Blacks not to whip her. And what did she do? She picked the blackest minded, blackest colored Black man she could find and married him. She married him for his qualities, but she married him because she loved Black people. And that man ended up becoming a person who owned a lot of land and subdivided it among the family. And when people were poor in the neighborhood, he would mortgage a part of the property to provide food and clothing for people in the community, and then pay that second off on the mortgage. He built the church and became the minister of the church. And his most important guest was Miss Ella Baker. She always got to sit in the special guest seat in the church, something that her mother resented. And whenever the grandfather would go out to preach around the country, he put her in his buggy and take her along, and they would have these conversations. And so the thing about Ella was that she tried to reproduce the sharing community that she saw in North Carolina. And the farmers there, under her grandfather's leadership, would take care of their crop and take it to market. And so she saw this sharing thing as very important. This communal thing was very important. And the man she married was like the man that her grandmother married. As Black as midnight and proud, and a brother who came from Shaw University. And they were married for some 20 years. Ella Baker was a believer that leaders were mouthpieces of the people. She believed that the people could lead themselves. Her mother and father, and especially her mother, was active in missionary work in the Black church and was a part of the women's section that women ruled. And so Ella said, her activism began through her involvement in the church, though she was not herself religious. She always belonged to a Black church, but it did not infect her politics. But it helped shape her activism because she drew from the activism of her mother. And these were women, African American women, who ran a section in the Black Baptist church run by women. And they provided a lot of help to everyday Black folks. Ella had a different attitude about helping Black people than her mother or father had. Their attitude was that the elite had to play a role in uplifting everyday people. Ella believed that the people could uplift themselves. And so she drew from that service tradition, particularly coming out of the Black woman's role in the community, but a service tradition in support of Black people freeing themselves. So Ella would bring that tradition into her organizing, a group-centered leadership where leaders are everyday people. And that would be the philosophy that she brings into the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that was in harmony with where the students wanted to go. And so this was her greatest contribution in her organizing, was to helping to support the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. As the SNCC leaders say, no Ella Baker, no SNCC, because she called the first conference at Shaw University, her university, that gave birth to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She protected SNCC from the other civil rights groups that wanted them to become a youth arm for them. Southern Christian Leadership Conference, C.O.R.E. She supported them in their playing an independent role as leaders on their own. And in her own community organizing, she practiced that with George Schuler, who later became a right-wing conservative, but at the time he worked with her was a progressive. And she and Schuler played roles as equals in building up a cooperative organization where they were doing various things. Bob Moses, who just recently passed, the best organizer to come out of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, his first work with Ella Baker was selling milk that was produced through a milk cooperative that Ella Baker had organized. Without the contacts that Ella had created as director of organization of the NAACP, where she organized thousands and thousands of Black people in the South into NAACP chapters, SNCC would have had difficulty in finding a direction in the South and in finding allies. She hooked them up with the generation of organizers like Amzie Moore and a brother named Steptoe, who come out of Mississippi and who were leaders in the Regional Council of Negro Leadership in the 1950s, where they had assemblies of 20,000 Black people in Mississippi. So Ella was the key to that. But Ella is an example of the best features of African and African American culture. She was shielded from a lot of the brutality that would come from whites. And I didn't point this out, like Toussaint stood up to whites as children. Toussaint beat the behind of a white on the plantation. That was a killing offense. You could be cut to pieces for that. And stood up to a slave master who was taking a horse from him. And Toussaint cut the saddle up. And when the white boy was going to whip him, Toussaint dared him to, and he didn't. And Ella Baker, when the chief of police son called her the N-word, she kicked his butt. And when she went home, her family encouraged her in that, because it was a family that believed in not turning the other cheek, that taught her that she was the best, as Toussaint was taught that he was destined for greatness. So, in looking at the sixfold stages to mental freedom, in the era of, in this case, in Africa, neocolonialism, where Africa is ruled indirectly by external forces, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and whatnot. In an era where Caribbean nations are independent, but again, manipulated by outside forces economically, in an era where forces have hit Black communities that have put us in a position of choosing between our rich new African and African culture and European culture. And we see the madness that has erupted in our communities with us inflicting death on each other, brought on by the drug traffic brought on by the CIA, but it is a mess that we have to clean up. And any organizer, the first organizer we got to do is the organization of the Black mind through systematizing the transformation of consciousness through going through the sixfold stages to mental freedom. Had the Panther leadership done this, they would have done much better. Had the leaders of the Nation of Islam internalized what Malcolm internalized, you wouldn't have seen some of the corruption that led to his death. Had Garvey in his movement been able to instill a deeper sense of African consciousness and new African and African Caribbean consciousness into the minds of his members, then they could have survived without him. As his wife observed, his second wife, she observed that without Garvey, most of the people who were supposed leaders in the UNIA were not capable of interpreting international and national events to figure out how to organize. They were good at giving canned speeches, those that could speak, but couldn't give a good address on the spur of the moment because they had not deeply immersed themselves in the history and in their culture. They had charisma, but creative thinking was lacking. And so the sixfold stages to mental freedom is the key to all freedom that will follow. If you're going to free the mind, if you're going to free the mind, then it is the key to freeing the community. It is the key to freeing the nation. And so the sixfold stages to mental freedom means that we've got to cultivate our consciousness, work on it, the way you work in tending a garden, uprooting the weeds. So Toussaint's weeds were the weeds left by Catholicism. Each of us have our own weeds that we have to pull up. But when we draw on the best of our culture and work on being the best human beings possible, we can go forward. So I hope you got something out of this. I would encourage people to enroll in the sixfold stages to mental freedom. Just send me a note. You can note it on the comments underneath this show with your email address. And I encourage people to subscribe to this show. I want to thank people for the donations they've made. We've increased our viewership by 100. This week, we reached over 400. And that was due to a drive that we did, a subscription drive we did last week that generated 1,650 more viewers. And we'll be doing more. This costs money. And so I thank the people who have made some contributions for that. So I hope you got something out of this. Hotep, and let's see what people have as comments or questions. Lao Tzu, Dr. Tshaka, how do we use the sixfold stages to mental freedom as a national program? For example, how can it apply in Haiti or Jamaica? Well, let's ask, how does it apply to us here too? First of all, I would say this, that what you should get from this discussion is that the Haitians don't need a whole lot. Their culture is pretty rich. And most of them aren't going to fall into the trap that Toussaint fell into. They know the brutality of the whites. Toussaint did it intellectually, but they experience it every day of their life. So swimming in the water of Afro-Haitian culture, I think, is the saving grace. The Haitians need to be left alone so they can do their own stuff. And whatever mess they got, they can clean it up. They're pretty good at it. These people are always fighting, you know. And Jamaica, you got the Rastas. They're strong. You've got the Garvey influence. That's strong. What Jamaica needs is, you know, going to be determined by Jamaicans. I don't have the answer for that. But the sixfold stages to mental freedom is key. And the leaders that will emerge, such as a Michael Manley, who emerged in the 70s, are those who are de-assimilated, those who are committed to the liberation of their people. And that's the key here, because we're in a big mess here. Freeing our minds from the mess of the choice between two cultures, from materialism, individualism, looking out for ourselves more than our people. And we have some in the younger generation who have embraced a struggle. And some of you don't like to deal with Black Lives Matter, but they did help put Trump out of the White House. You don't think that's important. Well, guess what? If he was there, you just see how devastating that would be. Shepsu Heru, Big Brother, thank you for such an enlightened lecture. Is there a term or concept for mindfulness and African spirituality? This mindful thing is something that people are drawing heavily from coming out of Hindu and spiritual culture, but especially Hindu spiritual culture, which has a lot to do with meditation and going inside ourselves. In African culture, that is the culture, I've referred to this before in ancient Kemet, is called Jeruma, G-E-R-U-M-A-A, or Bambara Ma. And notice, with the exception of one letter, G-E-R-M-A-A, T, right? So Jeruma is the self-mastered person. And so the African methods are different, The African methods have to deal with self-cultivation. For example, one of the methods that was used in ancient Kemet was a review method. At the end of each day, reviewing the day and reviewing what you said and what you did and how you interacted with other people, reviewing every part of it and noting those things that need to be corrected. Because in many ways, that review replicates the view of the afterlife that Africans have, that there will be a judgment. And so in that judgment, positive is going to get weighed against negative, and your ka or your destiny is going to tell on you. They're going to tell everything you did. That's your life force. That's your destiny. That's your spirit double. So that's one method. But mindfulness in the end is having mastery of self. Toussaint was very much into that. And so he took a lot of time working on himself. G-E-R-U, Jeruma, G-E-R-U-M-A-A. Brother Ogawa, question: did the Alata Nation contribute other warrior revolutionaries to the struggles in Africa or abroad? What I would say is that the Haitians made it a condition that any support they got from another nation, they work or carry out actions to end slavery. So, for example, the Colombian Simón Bolivar went after having a number of successful revolutions that then flipped on him. He ended up in Haiti for support. And he got support on condition that he ends slavery. So the Haitians have always been clear on that. And when Denmark Vesey raised up his rebellion in South Carolina, it was premised on the idea, because he had been in Haiti, he had been enslaved in Haiti, but he was there also during the Haitian Revolution. So he knew that Haiti was on the side of enslaved Africans. And so that was one of the things he did to recruit Africans, to let them know that. So that's the real question you should be asking. What did Haiti do? You know what I mean? Again, in what ways did Haiti's revolutionary actions inspire the runaway slaves in Spanish Florida? Did Haiti's freedom encourage those Africans to fight harder? Yeah, sure. That was the Seminole Nation and the runaway Africans, because Seminoles themselves were runaways. And they were led by Osceola, a Seminole leader. But there were two armies, the African army and the Native American army. I pointed out this before. The Seminole revolts were the only successful slave rebellions in the history of the United States, and the only successful war waged by Native Americans. They had successful battles, Little Bighorn, they had others. But this was a successful war based on the union of Africans and Native Americans. This is the great fear of your founding daddies, that either whites and blacks would unify, or that blacks and Native Americans would unify. And that's what happened in the Seminole Nation. And of course, they were also aided by weapons provided by the Spanish. Let's see. S.K.N.R.B.G. There are reports of slaves being boiled in the sugar boiling copper pots as punishment down here. Yeah, that's probably the case. Any torture you could think of, they did it. You understand? You want to talk about savages? And then got blacks running around here asking, are Africans savage? We got so much humanity in us that's unthinkable. Though some of us have gone off the charts recently. Okay, let's see if there's any other questions here. This is a question here. SKNRBG. Isn't Olata in what is now Republic of Benin? I'm not sure. I know that at this time they were a part of the Asante of the Ghanaian nation, so I'm not sure. I'd have to check that out. Shepsu Hero. So do you think that with enslaved mentality, you will be able to solve our enslaved mind? Can you solve the problem with the same mind that created the problem? I'm showing you that in the reality of slavery, Africans, many maintained free minds. They didn't all have enslaved minds. And the example of Toussaint is one example. The example of enslaved Africans in the US, there are multiple examples. And that is because it comes out of our culture. It also comes out of the deep understanding that as African people and as human beings, we're endowed with destinies, gifts. We're put on this earth for purposes, and it's not to be hewers of wood and drawers of water. It's not to be remote control, automatic pilot Negroes. You know what I mean? So if you've listened to what I've been laying out, then there was a whole lot more freedom of the mind on the plantation than you think. And some enslaved Africans were freer mentally than some of us are right now. But to the extent that mentalities were enslaved, then those are things that we've had to overcome. The sixfold stages of mental freedom is a part of that process. Brother Kamari currently helping to build an all-black town in Hancock County, Georgia. Tons of work and strategic and tactical planning. That's very good. Yeah, you've told me about that, and more people need to know about it. Shepsu Heru. It's important to have patience and consideration for those of us who are at the least doing the best we can in order to be involved with the transformation of consciousness. That's correct. People are at different stages and nobody has arrived. We're all working on this. Shepsu Heru, it's a process we all need to go through in order to get our minds back. It's easier said than done. It takes years. Yeah, correct. Another comment here. Yeah, threw away the slave mentality, which shall be named slave mind, and get it back. Get your mind back. If you do it, you won't ever call it tendency. And then there's a response here. I'm saying all of that because I wanted to get you out of your confusion, because the statement I made, and to which you have wondered whether I have listened to Dr. Toussaint. Okay. Shepsu Heru, we are talking about being indoctrinated in the system. Therefore, we have a predisposition to feel based on our colonized mind. Yes, but at the same time, we're in the process of freeing ourselves from it. You know, brother here, Reverend Shock, call it going back to be one. Shepsu Heru. That's not tendency. You have to retrieve your mind back, and there's a way. The mind of the second frequency. That's what we do have to do. Okay, Shepsu Heru again. I salute you, big brothers. Since being aware of our tendency to react with an enslaved mentality, African history, philosophy, and spirituality must be at the core of our personality foundation. True. Um, SKNRBG, is it true Mackendale started poisoning suspected traitor enslaved people because they were likely to tell? Mackendale did take some violent action against some enslaved Africans that he regarded as traitors. Toussaint didn't particularly like that, but yeah, he did do some of that. Again, SKNRBG, it was very easy to pick out the Obia practitioners in this country because it was the Protestant British that beat the French Catholics here. Yeah, and Obia gets often put down as devil worship and stuff like that, when in fact it's your traditional African spirit tradition operating in a Protestant context. Yeah, Brother Cinnabar, he's given praise to Bulalela Wabogo, not only for the sixfold stages to mental freedom, but also his northern cradle, southern cradle theory, which I'm about to completely demolish. Let's see if there's anything else here. Okay. Okay, let's see if there's anything on the bottom. Okay, we have Fred X. Hello, Doctor. Great show. Whose legislation has harmed the Black community in America the most? Trump or Biden or Obama? Well, come on now. Obama certainly, in his rescue of the economy, failed to rescue us. He did some things on the margin for us and kept it largely secret. Biden in his infrastructure has got some stuff that's good. There's a lot more that should be done. And because of two Democrats that have prevented the Democratic Party in the Senate from enacting his infrastructure bill, that's been held up. And Biden, because of his unwillingness to free himself completely of the filibuster, hasn't even put himself in the position where he could move against the filibuster, not that he has the votes now, and deal with voter rights legislation. And in fact, he's been willing to make some moves on the whole issue of abortion through executive orders, but he seems to be mainly talking when it comes to the issue of restoring Black voter rights. It will take federal legislation to do that, and even then, you're going to have the Supreme Court trying to come down on you, and the Supreme Court is exercising powers not given to it by the Constitution. That is to put checks on legislation. They grab that power. In the case of Trump, could there be any question? Trump didn't do SHIT for Black people. And in a second administration, Trump would end Social Security and take fascism to a level you don't want to see. In his effort to overthrow the last presidential election, he just gave you an indication of things to come. And he's also encouraging those forces of racist violence against blacks and people of color. Higher heck, a problem with obia is that malevolent-minded people can utilize it to negative effect. That's true of any spirit system. So it's a question of how we use those spirit systems. Carnita Groves, Hotep from Ghana. Is there an ancient or contemporary African standalone governance system that can replace current system? Yeah. Go watch my last show that was dealing with twinlinealism, and watch the others that look at twinlineal families, and read the book Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality that you can purchase through the Gumroad system. Yeah, it's our system. And I explain this in great detail. This book has an introduction by John Henry Clark and also by Asa Hilliard. It is considered a classic. But the model that I call twinlineal, or the model of male-female empowerment, where males and females have an equal say-so in governance, has been the model that's been adapted in Asante systems, was adapted in Kemetic systems, in various systems, and needs to be updated to a 21st century reality. And it's when the people have a major say-so in their governance, the say-so in their governance, that you're going to have the uprooting of economic oppression and other forms of oppression. And I see in Ghana right now, Ghana's going to the IMF for a loan, and they've admitted that there's been corruption in their government. That's an honest statement, but it's only when we draw from the best of our governance, which is our family systems, our political and economic and spiritual systems, updating them to 21st realities, are we going to have systems that reflect our views and empower us. And given the disruption caused by colonialism and by slavery, it's understandable that we departed from our way. We need to know our way so that we can return to it. And this twinlineal way is key, which is the way of all the males and females being equally empowered to govern every phase of society. And in Africa today, that especially means the empowerment of African women. So there's a lot in the traditional African system of Ghana that you can draw from in doing that as well. Okay. That looks like that's it. So, Hotep, I've enjoyed this. I hope you got something out of it. I put a lot of work into these shows, and subscribe. Encourage your friends to subscribe and make a contribution, because to grow this show, it takes a little financial contribution. See you next week. Hotep.